Hi, Glenn.
Hello, how are you?
Good, thanks. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Great. So in the past, I guess mastering had quite a specific role in terms of vinyl and things like that. How do you see the role of mastering in modern music in terms of the streaming era?
I don't think it's drastically different from the vinyl days in a lot of ways. And in recent years, it's kind of even swung back to that again as vinyl sales have kind of increased and people are rediscovering that format. But it's always kind of a preparation for release. And, we were always kind of the facilitators between the recording studio and the release. And I think we still maintain that position.
Can you hear when things aren't mastered if you're listening kind of casually?
It all depends on the mixer and how he's prepped his mixes. So sometimes I hear something and I know it's definitely not mastered. Other times I can hear things that sound like they might have been mastered or definitely were mastered. But a lot of mixers have different approaches, and some prepare things kind of not with a lot of post-production and let the mastering guy finish it if they have somebody that they trust and kind of like to tag team with. And other guys like to, get it sounding like it's finished. And there's a lot of post-production they do. And, that's a different approach, and they're both fine.
If someone asks you what you would prefer if they were handing you a project, would you ask them to leave certain things off the master, or would you tell them to do what they sound the best?
That approach has changed a lot over the years because people have really started using some post-production now. And when I say post-production, I'm talking about things after the mix on the stereo bus, kind of, late in the process, that become part of their sound. And the last thing I really want to do is tell somebody to undo their sound so I could redo it for them. Because no matter what I do, I'm not going to do exactly what their taste was. It may be something they like. And, if I'm lucky, 50% of the time they'll say they like it better. And maybe 50% of the time they say, oh, I like what I did better. So, I want them to do what they do, but I don't want to get a master that's compromised in dynamics preferably or made too loud. That's really the only request I have.
Do you have a policy in terms of revisions and number of revisions and that sort of thing?
It's not like a written in stone policy, but we tell clients basically that we want to make them happy. And, I normally never charge for mastering revisions. But if they come back to me and say, I feel like my vocal's too low, or, we left out an ad-lib in the third verse and we got to reprint the mixes again, then that's a different story. But, because the onus is on the mixer and the producer at that point to check their stuff before they handed it to me. And we also listen to, I also listen to all the files before we actually set up a mastering appointment. So if I hear something that's really out of whack, I will say something to the client beforehand to kind of prevent, a situation like that. But, so it's not a thing that we run into all the time. And honestly, revisions are a pretty low percentage of stuff. But it's more often that the artist will change something in the mix, and then we get a revision because of that.
What kind of percentage of your sessions are attended?
0. We used to have a big analog studio in Atlanta, and when I sold that studio, I went traveling for 4 years and worked out of remotely from 6 different countries, and was stationed in Iceland, was stationed in Europe, was stationed in Asia all over, and yeah, it was a fun time, but it helped me explore some new techniques and so on.
Do you maybe talk about some of those techniques that come to mind, the things that you got from traveling?
Well, I think the biggest one is learning how to listen again. And when you've been in a room, I had a great Francis Manzella, same guy that did the old Sterling Sound, designed room in Atlanta, well, rooms, at several rooms. And we had, fantastic monitoring and all that stuff. And, I was very used to that. And, subsequently I started working with in-ears and traveled with in-ears probably for about 4 years, and got used to those as opposed to working in a room. And it took a little while for my brain to translate all of the sonics and, my bass instincts to kind of transfer over to listening in a different way. And now I use both headphones and in-ears. And, I haven't worked with monitors in almost 5 years now. So.
Do you have certain favorite pairs of headphones that you go to every day?
I do, actually. There's a company I work with called Audeze, and I work with a set of their headphones called LCD4s. They're planar headphones, and I also use a company called Chord Electronics, lovely English company, for my DACs and so forth, and to power those puppies. And been very happy with both.
Are you just working totally digitally now, or is there any analog part of the chain too?
I've gone back and forth because, I started slowly selling off my analog studio. And I think everybody in our business has this romantic thing about all their analog gear. And it's like, they're children. And, I can't sell my old, Neumann this or this, or, and I'd hang on to them for years. And every once in a while, I'd throw them back in the chain and say, oh, let's see, how this old friend is. And most of the time I was kind of disappointed. It kind of introduced a bunch of stuff, as well as randomizing the ability to kind of come back to the same place again. And one of the most important things right now is that, my clients especially want their stuff quick. And they want it the same as what they had, except they wanted this change. And so if I'm doing a recall or something like that, when I go analog, and this was the case even way back then, when I had a full analog setup, when I go back to recall stuff, it wasn't ever exactly the same. You could write down all your settings, come back to everything, but it never quite sounded the same. So I'm much happier now.
Good. In terms of EQ and compression, are you generally relying on one or two things to do kind of a bit of everything for you, or are you stacking multiple compressors with more kind of specific jobs?
It all depends on, the track. So in general, I don't really use compression very much. And sometimes I'll throw in a compressor for color, but I don't usually have any of the meters moving for gain reduction anyway, because everything's pretty compressed nowadays, and everybody's got a million instances of whatever compressor they want. So it's pretty rare I get something that's too dynamic. And for the most part, it's just kind of add a little color here, or and I'll use like a bunch of different things depending on what the track needs. So.
Are there any things outside of that you use regularly, like images or reverb or?
No, I one of those mastering guys that firmly believe that reverb is for a mixer to use, and if something has the improper balance of spatial stuff and ambience, I'll always say, hey mixer, did you notice this? And, maybe you want to adjust it, because those balances to me aren't for a mastering guy to choose. We're here to polish a final product and not make mixing decisions, which, there's a lot of guys in my field that like the stem mastering and other stuff, and I'm a big no on that. I think the mixers need to do their job and mix something. And if something's not right, they should fix it and not hand it off to the mastering guy.
Do you ever use things like distortion or saturation?
I think I've always used distortion and saturation, but back in the day, it was just jamming signal into something else till it distorted. So, and you can still do the same thing in digital, but, the digital stuff, depending on what it is, has a different response for gain staging than analog stuff has.
Is saturation something that you would use kind of perceivably on a master? Would that be too much of
I
an
don't
artistic?
think perceive it is. No, unless you were going for something just kind of way out of the norm of ballpark audio. I want my stuff to sound clean. So, there's saturation the way everybody used to use it back in the day, whether it was, slamming the tape or, just running stuff hot into an A to D or, and those were pleasant distortions and didn't really, you weren't necessarily aware that you were hearing distortion. They all just sounded good to you or smooth to you, or, they'd add tape compression or other things that would be to your ear perceived as something smooth, but not perceived as distortion. So, I'm kind of in that school that you don't want to perceive distortion.
Do you use images or MidSide processing much?
I do occasionally, sure. MidSide is something, I think every mastering guy uses. And you need to use it judiciously, if I could say it, judiciously, as it can get out of hand really easy. And, it can really whack out somebody's mixes quite easy. So,
could you talk through some of your favorite EQs that you use?
As of recently, I've been using acoustic audio stuff quite a bit. And, I use several of their EQs. But, EQs are such, there's the right EQ for the right track. And there's, you could say cut 5K with one EQ at a certain bandwidth, and you use 3 different EQs and they have 3 different sounds. So I use stuff from different companies as well, but I really want to try to match the flavor of what's really kind of sounding pleasant with things to the track. So nothing specifically I use every day. But there'll be like a palette of, maybe 4 or 5 different EQs that I'll kind of choose from and see what I like. I use Acoustica, their gold stuff quite a bit. And it's the old Neve remake. And, that's always kind of pleasant for most stuff. But then occasionally I'll find, nope, didn't work. And I got to pull, a Brainworks piece out or something like that and, see how it reacts. So,
do you use dynamic EQs or multiband compression much?
No. I'm not a big fan of either of those, and I find they kind of mostly kind of whack out things where I can tell it's unnatural at that point. They have their uses, and if I need to do something specific, like a DS something or whatever that I need to use a dynamic EQ, I'll use it in that kind of instance, but otherwise, no, I try to stay away from that kind of stuff.
I know people quite often think of mastering as sort of kind of making something sound like a record. If you're quite light on a lot of processing, then are there any particular things to you that kind of make something sound like a record?
That's a good question. I think part of it is the glue that kind of makes a mix feel, cohesive. And some of that can come from, the mix, and some of that can come from the mastering. So, having stuff that's not jutting out both sonically, dynamically, is important. And I think that's, the dynamic should be, unless they're trying to do something different, should be balanced within the track. And, I want something to have a balanced feel. That's really all I try at the end of the day.
Are there any, I don't know, you've mentioned a few, but are there any common things that when mixes come to you, you notice the problems, kind of things that come up the most?
Things are too loud almost always. But I understand that. Clients want loud references, and, even the non-loud references are still pretty loud now. So, what else? Things come in usually too bright for the most part. People have, brightened up stuff with EQs that didn't need it, especially a lot of sampled sounds and so on, where, it's a sound that's already been EQ'd and compressed, and the mixer is now EQ'd it a third or fourth time, and it's kind of lost its, natural tone and kind of gets harsh. So I'd say that, and then the last thing is probably vocals that are recorded in a bad room, and where you can really hear that it was done in, kind of a non-professional studio, even if it was done by somebody professional. So, sometimes they get lucky and sometimes they don't. But that all depends on, we have artists that are, touring and they're recording something in a hotel room, or, I understand there's limitations to what people can do sometimes.
Is there anything that's more important for the kind of final result that you think most people don't really think of?
More important as to what?
Well, let me rephrase that. Is there anything that you think's more important than other people think it is for the final result?
For me, especially like indie rock and some things like that, where they're purposefully burying like a vocal to make it not sound like a pop record. I personally can't stand that. And, I understand it's kind of an aesthetic that some people prefer, but honestly, if somebody's going to sing or record something, I want to hear the parts. And even if it's not a pop record, I want to have the sensibility that I can hear what the vocalist is doing, even if it's mumbling or gargling or screaming at the top of their lungs. So I still like a balance of things where you can hear stuff. And a lot of people try to get artistic in that way, and I'm not necessarily a big fan of that.
Is there anything that you think is not as important as most people make it out to be?
Yeah, I think equipment is not that important. People are worried about having the newest or the oldest or the best or whatever, and people rarely spend the time to learn the tools that they have already. So, I think the people always come to me and say, do I need to give you, 96K files, or do I need to record this in 32-bit, or, should I get this new, blah, 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 plugin or modeling mic or whatever it is? And for the most part, no, you probably don't need it. And, I still have great recordings coming in at, lower resolution, like 48 or 41, 44.1. And, most of the professional mixers I know, it's kind of just getting up to a higher sample rate now. But even though they could have done it years ago, they're comfortable, running stuff at 44 or 48 because their computers run well and they don't crash as much. And you don't spend as much time transferring files. And, the sound difference is minute. So,
have you done much mastering of live albums? And if so, is there any kind of big difference?
Live albums are very different. And yeah, sure. I mean, I've been doing it for 26 years now. So yeah, I've done a bunch of live records. But I think the main thing in live records is if there's continuity on the recording place. So if they've done all these concerts in one venue, all the songs rather, then, you want to treat it similarly. But, a lot of times there'll be 3 songs from one venue and 10 songs from another venue, and they sound very different. And you just want to get some continuity between the stuff. But in general, I mean, it's usually, live albums are okay, but not my favorite.
Do you have certain techniques that you use to get continuity between different things like that?
It's not techniques as much as just listening. You'll hear, this venue had, a booming low mid going there, or, the mix on this venue, they really, put the drum mics hot. And, if that was the case, I'd probably calm down the high end to let all that cymbal crashing and all that stuff not be as annoying when you listen to it next to the ones that are better balanced from the other stuff. So
I'm not sure how much recording and mixing you still do, but has mastering changed the way you approach those two things?
I don't really do much of the other anymore. I did certainly back in the day. I started kind of as a producer and a musician, and was a mixer for many years too. But I think my approach would be quite different now. I think I would do much less than I would have back in the day, and treated things much kinder. I think I would have had a heavier hand back in the day compared to what I do now. So,
just to finish up, could you talk a little bit about how you got started in mastering and kind of your career up until now?
So my background is basically I grew up in New York City, and I was a musician. I was a guitar player and playing in a bunch of bands when I was a kid. And I started going into the studio to record some of those bands, and people would ask me to do things for other folks at the studio because I kind of was teaching myself at the time on how to engineer. And there was somebody next to me actually from one of the first hip hop labels in New York. And he asked me if I could come play and help him record next door. And he's the guy's named Spider D. And he was the guy that kind of started me in the studio. And we recorded a whole bunch of records together. And, we'd produce and mix and, do everything on these records. And years later, after I started mixing records, I had a producer I used to work with, and he handed me a bunch of Neumann EQs and compressors, and he said, you should try mastering. I think you'd be good at it. And he left them at my studio one day, and I mastered some of my clients I was mixing at the time, which is probably not the best idea. But I did it, and it sounded pretty good for what they said anyway. And so I kind of felt like it was a better fit than what I was doing for me before. It just kind of matched my personality better to be looking at stuff from a 10,000-foot view rather than a 10-foot view. And, I kind of took to it quickly. So that is the story.
Do you have any kind of single piece of work that you think of that you're most proud of?
That's tough. There's a lot of work that I think, is okay. I don't really like to listen to my stuff after I finish it. People come back to me about certain records, and, recently, the last few years, people come up to me about an artist named Future, who did a record called DS2, which has become like kind of a hip hop trap classic for people. And so I get that record a lot. And it's kind of like it's a lot of people's reference for bass apparently now. And my dear friend Seth, who was the mix engineer in that, who passed away the year before, we had a just wonderful relationship. And so any of the records I did with him kind of always hold a nice place.
I think that's all my questions. So thank you so much for speaking with me.
Sure. It's a pleasure.